Hello and welcome back to Rage Gaming. It's time to talk builds. This is an interesting one because we're now reaching a stopping point for the current meta. The pit pushing is continuing, but the tiers achieved are starting to come slower, number by number. That gives us, in theory, a pretty good way to judge builds and decide based off that which is going to be the best overall for each class. But I don't think that's always going to be 100% accurate. Pit builds could focus heavily on survivability, which may result in less output, creating an issue in boss farming or general content for your average player. You don't need a ton of damage reduction to clear a Helltide effectively. You want fast-paced movement and AoE clear. A universal build needs to be good at all of it. So it's a dream when a pit pushing build also lines up with what's best generally, and a couple classes do kind of have that, but there are clear examples of where there are pit builds and general builds that are very different. Pit builds aren't necessarily the best build overall. So with that said, let's get into it. We'll begin with Sorcerer, which is a good example of what I've just talked about. Right now, if we look at the pit situation, you've got a meta that, as Josh calls it, has devolved. Essentially, it comes down to the maximum damage you can put out while maintaining a permanent flame shield. So there's loads of builds that do that work in longer flame shield and better cooldown reduction for flame shield. You've got lots of options of what you're going to do on top of that, but the winner of that race currently is the firewall setup, shooting firebolts through a firewall to increase the damage and spread more bolts around. There was brief hope for frozen orb to compete with output, and there's still potential for ball lightning, but for now the king is just firebolts. What we're talking about is mostly the same build, but what's your source of damage? Is that really going to be the best for boss farming or Helltides or whatever else you might be doing as a more normal player? I just don't think so. The loss of screen blasting at high pace to achieve immortality is certainly a helpful thing in the pits, but not so helpful anywhere else. I asked Josh what he would pick for a normal player that wants to clear higher pit tiers, say even the 80s. That's where you'll get all the masterwork materials you need. You don't need to worry about more than that. And he could not give me a clean answer. That's where Sorcerer is at right now. Between Frozen Orb, Ball Lightning, Blizzard Ice Spikes, they're all so competitive with one another. They all do the same things very well. So it would seem that it comes down to personal preference, what you enjoy about the different builds, maybe even the visual appeal of the spells. Technically though, it does look like something like Ice Spikes Blizzard would be your cleanest option for farming pits materials overall quickly, which definitely should be said. So that's the one I'll suggest for Sorcerer, though it's obviously very close. Next though, let's move on to a class that has one surefire answer to this question. The best build for Rogue seems to be the insane Heartseeker build. We're talking about a build that's actually centered around a basic attack of all things with some hyper investment to reach the absolute maximum attacks per second, the minimum frames between each cast, resulting in that insane machine gun style firing. With this constant stream of blows, the undying aspect becomes an incredible source of sustain. It heals you for this small percent per skill used. And when you're using Heartseeker so many times a second, this suddenly becomes incredible healing. When you combine that healing and the output with some control, you're able to kind of do it all. You're locking down the enemies, you're sustaining through any damage, you're smashing the targets. The single target DPS is phenomenal, but then the AoE potential as the Heartseekers bounce around, that's still fantastic as well. If somehow anything actually hits you, the raw healing is ready to just keep you going, and you're able to lock things down so effectively that damage doesn't necessarily come your way anyway. Also, this is a rogue, so its base movement speed is very good. The dashing and teleporting, you can evade out of any dangerous mechanical spot quickly while moving through a dungeon at extreme pace. I think this is incredible, so props to the player Mippy for coming up with this one, at least to my knowledge. He burst onto the Season 4 scene with it and has been the top of the pit pushing since. I don't really know where the build is weak, so if I was going to suggest any build for Rogue right now, it'd probably be this one, the Heartseeker Rogue. So with that pretty quick one out the way, let's now bring it to my main class, which is the Necromancer. This is another one I think should be a straightforward answer, but the truth is there's quite a lot of variance of the full minion Necromancer to choose between. I do think it's undeniable that the highest burst numbers you'll see is with the golem focused version. I think we saw it was a 56 billion hit from Vega at this point, and then you got the highest pit clears with or without holy bolts, both being golem focused builds. Full minion Necromancer is also what I choose to play myself because it's just so good. Single target, AoE, you can really focus on movement speed to combat that slow nature of the Necromancer, and hey, we're actually hitting the class fantasy. The golem's always been a really cool minion concept, a big hulking monster made of iron or bone or blood, and we'd always sacrifice it normally. So it's been a long time coming. That's not to say that the different variants of the minion builds aren't great or even competitive. The Shadow Minions builds are not too far behind. I've seen a build that's cleared a tier 121 without holy bolts, and hey, they didn't use golem. There's also blight focus builds, corpse explosion stuff with bombardier setups. You could drop Army of the Dead for Bone Storm. There's many options around what is essentially the same core, but do play quite differently. Overall, I would argue the golem build can handle it all best, though I think it's lacking on survivability compared to some other classes we'll talk about today. So, in terms of pit builds versus normal gameplay, there's a serious focus on defense for obvious reasons. For me, that's the difference of running Blood Mist versus Corpse Explosion or Blight. Corpse Explosion provides way more consistent DPS, and Blight less consistent but bigger bursts. Meanwhile, Blood Mist allows you to sneak in this opportunity to still get Corpse Explosions, though less consistently, but then you actually get this defensive, a very helpful iframe skill. But that's also completely unnecessary everywhere else in the game. There's no threat that's going to need that. It's better to just have the maximum DPS, such as say my boss killer setup, where I'm just spamming explosions for better CDR. So between all of them, I don't think the difference is absolutely massive. We're talking about a couple skill changes, aspect changes, but again, the same core. Performing different sacrifices to increase your survivability just at the cost of output to push pits further. Obviously, Golem Minion is the strongest in the pit listings right now. It's also the heaviest hitter for boss bursting, and you can very casually AFK in Helltide or wherever. The minions just kill things for you. It's also an incredibly popular build for a reason, so I just think Golem Minion Necromancer is the one to pick. This then brings us to our next class. Let's now talk about Druid. This is a funny one because outside of the pits, I think the answer is clearly Tornado Werewolf. It's able to blast through the place very quickly with great movement speed. It has a kind of range style because of the tornadoes. You slap them out and then they move around, which lets you drop them and then keep moving, which is incredible for clearing packs of enemies and moving through dungeons very quickly. The output it has too is really good. So it's a good choice, top choice even, for boss killing on top of all of that. Yet the survivability is the big negative here, which has been a major problem in the pits for this class. It just can't take the same level of hits as others, and when you're running around avoiding mechanics to stop the damage, you're no longer actually attacking the boss, so your DPS is falling off a cliff. In pits, it really struggles in that way, so it was Ace of Spades Shots who came up with this great solution to that. This is Wind Shear, which provides that survivability through, yes, a bit more tankiness, mainly by playing at medium to even long range. And it's attacking very quick, much like a machine gun like the Rogue one. A constant stream of these shots can be maintained at all times. You're able to weave in a bit of mobility to dodge mechanics, and because it doesn't matter whether you're close or far and keep sending out those shears, you never really drop the DPS. That DPS that you're putting out, I don't think is necessarily as good as Tornado Werewolf, so it comes down to, with Druid, what is your goal? If you're a more casual player and you're interested in completing the content available, being fully upgraded and all that, but you're not planning on forcing yourself into tier 100s and so on, in that case you're going to be more than fine on Werewolf Tornado. It's incredible, and that's probably what I would suggest. But at the same time, it's important to know that Wind Shear is probably the play for high pit pushing if that is your plan. That brings us to the last class then, and that's Barbarian. And this, once again, comes down to what you want to do as a player. Do you want to push the high level pits as far as you can, or are you more interested in achieving everything that actually has rewards in this season? To me, that will come down to Thorns for pits, or Bash Barb for everything else, including lower level pits, sub tier 100 or whatever. You might wonder about Dust Devils. That is a fun and very effective build, but when it comes to single target, Dust Devil is just not competitive in that way, certainly not with Bash Barb. Dust Devil's great for mob clear, open world content, dungeon pushing, but Bash absolutely destroys. And even then, with a proper setup, you'll have a nice cleave on it, so it's going to be great for mob clear all the same. Between Dust Devils and Bash, for your average player, I'd advocate for Bash. But what about Thorns? Thorns is also dealing shocking damage, despite being focused on, the enemy attacking you and maybe being more concerned with pushing your defensives than normal. Barbarian is already naturally tanky. We saw this in the Abattoir with it being the dominant class. In pits, it'd be the same. They'd be dominating right now, if not for the Holy Bolt silliness that Necromancers are currently relying on. Barbs have still been pushing the limits though, only trailing behind Necromancers by a couple tiers. So why Thorns? It's just been way better this season. The amount of Thorn stacking you can reach with the new Razor Plates and the way you can masterwork those to really high numbers on top of other sources, it gets hefty. You also basically become damage immune, so you stop thinking about mechanics entirely. We're talking about tier 130 pluses, by the way, where everyone is being one-shot by echoes no matter what setup they have. Necromancer might be ahead in the tiers, but it's constantly having to avoid the mechanics. Barb, on the other hand, can just face tank it. The skill of the fight is basically removed. Still, despite Thorns having good output and it being the highest pit pusher right now, I'm not sure I should suggest it as the best build to run for everyone. It requires big investment And personally, I don't find it that engaging to play. Plus, Bash Barb is still very effective in the pits. You'll have no problem pushing it past tier 80s, that's for sure. You could easily do well in over 100s. And if you're doing other content and aren't really excited by the concept of thorns, then Bash Barb is probably the suggestion I'll go with. But yeah, it's been interesting to see the differences between hard pit pushing builds and the more normal, universal purpose builds. As we get deeper into the pit tiers, you see more and more clever changes that people are making to get the most out of their setup for this challenge. Things become more niche and more single-minded. I hope this highlights the differences and my perspective on it has maybe been useful or just interesting. For now though, I've been Hollow, you've been you, thanks for watching.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.